Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Boris Johnson has flown back overnight from New York to address MPs. They are back at Westminster now after the suspension of Parliament was ruled unlawful by the Supreme Court yesterday. In angry exchanges in the Commons, the Attorney-General called opposition parties cowards for not agreeing to an early election and branded Parliament a disgrace. He was in turn accused of knowing no shame. The Prime Minister is due to appear in the Commons any time now. Our political editor, Laura Kuhnsberg, reports.
To lead, often, is to be alone. It was Boris Johnson on the tarmac clutching his red box of government business. Boris Johnson's decision to suspend Parliament that was against the law. And Boris Johnson speeding back from New York to face MPs' wrath. Parliament returned today to its formal business.
Hats off, strangers!
Back to the familiar ritual, back to the familiar frenzy.
Welcome back to our place of work.
The government's top lawyer trying to defend their humiliation in court.
I took a close interest in the case. The government accepts the judgment and accepts that it lost the case. And at all times, the government acted in good faith.
But then he turned full bellow on the opposition for swerving an election right now.
This Parliament is a dead Parliament. It should no longer sit. It has no moral right to sit on these green benches. They could vote no confidence at any time. But they're too cowardly. This Parliament is a disgrace.
Provoking pure fury, tempers lost long ago.
To come here with this barrister's bluster to obfuscate the truth, and for a man like him, a party like this, and a leader like this Prime Minister, to talk about morals and morality is a disgrace!
This Remain Parliament that has talked about Brexit for over 3.5 years will now get several more weeks to do what they possibly can to talk about Brexit, but make absolutely certain that 17.4 million people never get what they voted for.
A few voices urging cooperation, but they were in short supply.
Can I urge the Attorney-General to work with colleagues to try and find that compromise and to cease this language of pitting Parliament against the people?
Opposition MPs on all sides, though, are working out what to do next.
This is one of the most exciting times possible in Parliament.
An election won't be the answer. Not until Labour is sure they've ruled out leaving the EU without a deal.
At that point, it would be appropriate to move a motion of no confidence in order to force the government to resign and to have a general election.
Could that moment be sooner than later? Although some Brexiteers are desperate to leave, the Lib Dems might try to ensure a delay to Brexit is agreed as soon as possible.
So Liberal Democrats will be working with and talking with people across the different parties to find a way to remove that threat of a no-deal Brexit more quickly. Thank you very much. We need to go and get into Parliament. Thank you.
Did you get it wrong, Mr. Cummings?
Before that, though, flanked by his contentious advisor, Dominic Cummings, it's for the Prime Minister now to face his foes. However much the pair may enjoy provocation, this is a dangerous road.
Well, let's join Laura now. Laura, we saw the Prime Minister on his way to the Commons there. We're waiting for him to talk in the chamber. What can we expect to hear from him?
Well, Fiona, you're right. Boris Johnson will be on his feet in the Commons in about 25 minutes or so, and I think he will face a torrent of vitriol, very serious questions about his own response to the dramatic judgment from the Supreme Court yesterday. In public so far, Boris Johnson has said that he strongly disagrees with the verdict, but of course will respect it. But I think he will really be under the cosh on the strategy that he has chosen to take. But will he change it? Will he shift? Will he budge? Well, everything we've seen from this Prime Minister so far has suggested that he believes that attack is the best form of defence. And I expect, as we saw very dramatically from the Attorney General earlier, he will again try to turn this on the opposition parties and say, well, look, if you don't like it, then have the guts to go to the country in an election. But equally, on the other side, the opposition parties just are not going to budge on their demand to make it as watertight as they possibly can that we do not leave the European Union without a deal before they agree to give everybody around the country a choice at the ballot box in that election. This may be a parliament that cannot agree on anything, but while this happens, it's a government that can't govern properly either.
Laura at Westminster, thank you. Well, yesterday's ruling by the Supreme Court has prompted thousands of questions from you across BBC News. Our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar, has had a go at answering some of your questions.
What happens next?
Well, Boris Johnson was already in a tight political corner, and he still is. Just look at his relentless pressure to force an early election. The mood has been transformed. The ferocity of the argument off the scale. And now the government's opponents are back in the Commons. They can close in. Try to pass legislation to tighten up the law they've already passed to close off the option of leaving with no deal on October the 31st. And force Boris Johnson to either land a deal or do the last thing that he wants, to seek another Brexit extension.
Will Brexit happen?
Good question. Wish I knew. Out here, against Brexit, for Brexit, they'd love to know the answer. A lot depends on the Brexit negotiations in Brussels, where the UK side and the EU side are still some way apart. And the EU summit on October the 17th is rushing up fast. No deal by October the 19th, and Boris Johnson, by law, will have to extend Brexit, or try to, unless, that is, the EU or any of its members decide they've had enough, in which case Britain is shown the door. In the end, after 3 years, if Parliament can't decide all this, it may be up to you.
Will there be a general election?
Now that's an easy one, and the answer's yes. All sides want an election. The argument is about when. Opposition MPs say no election until a no-deal Brexit is off the table. They say they're worried about the disruption a no-deal Brexit would cause, but they know, and so does the Prime Minister, that a delay would cost the Tories lots of Brexit supporters' votes. Boris Johnson's election challenges, his taunts of cowardice, are not working. He's under pressure, and when he says he wants a deal, he means it. This won't be a one-issue election, but it'll seem like it, and it's coming soon.
John Pienaar there answering some of your questions. Well, with so much uncertainty about Brexit, what do voters make of today's developments? In Portsmouth, 58% of people voted to leave the European Union, while almost 42% voted to remain. Our special correspondent Lucy Manning has spent the day there.
I will remain confident in this. I will see the goodness of the Lord. I will remain. I will remain.
This was just a coincidence. The University Gospel Choir is not singing about Brexit. The Prime Minister not liking what he heard from the Supreme Court.
I personally believe that he's acting quite outrageously, and it's not in thought of the country but himself.
All Labour supporters in the middle, Rachel backs leave. Precious and Blessing remain.
In order for Brexit to happen, he needs the help of the other MPs. It's not something that he can do by himself. So I do think that he probably had the right idea, but just went about it the wrong way, I think.
Do you think there should be a general election?
Not yet. I think let's sort out Brexit, let's get that sorted, and then afterwards, let's do an election.
Portsmouth is one of the busiest ferry ports, and there are concerns about the impact of a no-deal Brexit. 70% of the UK's bananas come through here. Defeat in the courts after repeated defeats in Parliament might not look like the best way to win an election in this marginal Labour seat, but the Prime Minister will be hoping his strategy of appearing to back voters against Parliament will pay off. At Fratton Community Centre, Conservative Leave voter Michael supports him. Who do you think's right, the courts or the Prime Minister?
Well, I think the Prime Minister, because he leads the country. He's about the only one who's going to get his seat.
What should MPs be doing now they're back today?
Well, I heard an MP say this morning he ain't got a clue what he's going to do.
Leavers like Joyce feeling a little stitched up by MPs and the court. She did vote Conservative.
I think he's doing his best. I don't know that he's going to get to results. I should be voting Brexit Party.
You don't think Boris Johnson's doing enough?
I think anybody will let him. I don't think the other half of Parliament will actually allow him to.
Hazel was a Lib Dem voter.
Lawyers get involved in Parliament. Are we then going to find that everybody goes to the legal system and says, I don't agree with that?
Would you support the Prime Minister at an election if he did manage to get the country out?
If he got us out, yes, then I would back him.
A warning here for all MPs, though. Voters told us they want them to use the extra days in Parliament to talk about issues that don't involve Brexit. Lucy Manning, BBC News.
Well, as well as dealing with the fallout from yesterday's Supreme Court ruling, the Prime Minister is also under growing pressure about his relationship with an American businesswoman. Jennifer Arcuri was recently awarded over £100,000 in government grants, and during Boris Johnson's time as London Mayor, she was invited on several overseas trips. Our Home Affairs correspondent Daniel Sanford's here. So, Daniel, tell us what this is all about.
Well, on the very first day of the newly reopened Parliament, Boris Johnson's brand new digital minister, Matt Warman, found himself answering awkward questions about his boss's relationship with this American tech entrepreneur, Jennifer Arcuri. The minister defended the £100,000 grant that had been given to one of Miss Arcuri's tech companies, Hacker House, saying that Boris Johnson and his staff had absolutely no role in the award of the grant, and he's saying there was no reason to think there was anything untoward. Boris Johnson was, after all, a backbencher at the time that the grant was made, but there is an internal review going on inside the department to work out whether the award was appropriately made. The minister said that this was a British company with a British telephone number, though when I telephoned what appeared to be a London telephone number today, it was actually answered by a woman who was clearly in California. So that telephone number doesn't really tell you very much about where the business is based. And Boris Johnson's also perhaps facing more difficult questions about his time as London Mayor and the apparently preferential treatment given to Jennifer Arcuri, in particular going on 3 trade missions with Boris Johnson overseas. So she's insisted in a statement that she was on those trips purely in her role as a legitimate businesswoman. I don't think this is an issue that's going to go away, Fiona.
Daniel, thank you.
Well, Boris Johnson is back in front of the reopened House of Commons this evening, facing questions from MPs about his failure to prorogue Parliament and his plans for Brexit. The Prime Minister rushed back from his visit to the United Nations in New York early this morning after the Supreme Court said his suspension of Parliament was unlawful and then promptly cancelled it. In a typically robust speech at the dispatch box just minutes ago, he said the Supreme Court had been wrong to get involved in what he described as a political question. Labour's Jeremy Corbyn described him as dangerous and not fit to hold the office of Prime Minister. Well, Mr Johnson is being questioned by MPs in the Commons now by the former leader Ian Duncan-Smith. Let's have a listen into that now.
I understand now that his government has changed the root origin of the term Yellowhammer to describe the botched attempt by the Leader of the Opposition to dispatch his own deputy. And could I ask him? I received and saw in my constituency, as others did recently, leaflets from the Labour Party calling for a general election now. Could he answer me this question? Can he give me any reason why we are not having an election at this particular point? Does he think for any moment it could be because the Leader of the Opposition fears his own party just as much as he fears us?
Prime Minister. I thank my right honourable friend for his very acute question, Mr Speaker, and I'm afraid the answer is very simple, that they don't want an election because they are not sure that the public would trust them with the government of this country, and I think that they're right, and I think that they put the yellow into Yellowhammer, Mr Speaker.
Well, the Prime Minister there on very robust form, it has to be said. Well, with me now is political editor Gary Gibbon. Gary.
I think the great question in people's minds with
what happened at the Supreme Court was, will this lead to any kind of change in government strategy? It looked as though bits were falling off the strategy. I think what we saw today was, right now, as we speak, no, that strategy has not changed. The only thing that really changed today is that they've doubled down on the rhetoric. The first clue was Geoffrey Cox, the Attorney General, very strident language attacking this Parliament and saying it should disperse, it should go back to the electorate, it should shut itself down for good. And then we glimpsed Dominic Cummings, the Prime Minister's chief aide, coming to the House of Commons with him. That's a sure sign the strategy hasn't changed. And then we heard Boris Johnson putting it up to the opposition and saying, you don't like this government, you're trying to make me powerless. I paraphrase, but that's more or less what the Attorney General said earlier. Let's have a general election, and why don't you table a vote of no confidence? It doesn't look as though he's going to table his own bit of legislation which could trigger such a thing, but he is telling them to do it. They're not going to do it, the opposition, because they think that it's a trap. It's a trap that he would use to try and make sure that we slid out with no deal on the 31st of October. They're not going to go near that, but what are they going to do with these extra days that they've gained for themselves? Not at all clear. I think they've been slightly bounced and there's a bit of disagreement. Should you tighten the noose a bit more on the Prime Minister's hands and maybe even restrict him a little bit more, tightening the timetable on how early he has to commit to trying to get an extension on Brexit? No uniformity of view on the opposition there. So the only thing we can really say that we've learnt today is that the rhetorical lines that were developed by Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson, Parliament versus the people, are still very much the lines that the government is trying to work on. This was a day that started, of course, with a grey RAF plane crawling through the grey skies above Heathrow.
Dragged back early from New York, the Prime Minister had sent Parliament away. The Supreme Court had called it back, and Boris Johnson had to turn up to be questioned. His every move tracked from the air like a US crime show following a fugitive. Past the London pad of the Queen, who he dragged into his failed enterprise to suspend Parliament. While he freshened up, his parliamentary tormentors were at the gates, talking of more laws to tie his hands.
If anything has been shown in the last few weeks and months, it's that Parliament can be innovative and inventive.
So you might have to force feed him with some other legislation.
If we have to, we will do so.
The Speaker's procession began the parliamentary day that wasn't meant to happen, pulling MPs back from around the world, and one just married, abandoning a honeymoon.
You got married on Saturday.
On Saturday.
Meant to be on honeymoon today.
Yes.
And then you're sitting watching the court judgment to see whether it's going to happen or not.
Rock and roll, isn't it?
But the sudden return of MPs meant they didn't have the usual packed agenda on the order paper, but a blank sheet. MPs demanded the Attorney General explain his legal advice on suspending Parliament. He declared this Parliament finished.
This Parliament is a dead Parliament. It should no longer sit. It has no moral right to sit on these green benches. This Parliament is a disgrace. This Parliament is as dead can be.
It's not the rhetoric you'd expect if you're a government about to seal the Brexit deal and have to charm this Parliament into voting for it. The Attorney General was accused of lacking any shame over the Supreme Court's judgment.
Mr. Speaker, I came into the chamber today thinking I felt sorry for the Attorney General. But as he started, I did, fair enough, but every word he has uttered, no shame today, no shame at all. The fact that this government cynically manipulated the prorogation to shut down this House so that it couldn't work as a democratic assembly. He knows that that is the truth. And to come here with his barrister's bluster to obfuscate the truth, and for a man like him, a party like this, and a leader like this Prime Minister, to talk about morals and morality is a disgrace!
I'm not sure I could discern in that marshmallow of the rhetoric any actual question.
I must raise my concerns about the Attorney General constantly saying that this Parliament is dead.
This Parliament was elected in 2017. It reflects the divisions in this country, the divisions in our communities and the divisions in our families. Cease this language of pitting Parliament against the people.
Did you get it wrong, Mr Cummings?
The Prime Minister, with his casually dressed main advisor, Dominic Cummings, in the last few minutes finally got his slot in the hastily thrown together Commons agenda. A few hours after his own Attorney-General suggested he was heading a government that cannot govern.
It is absolutely no disrespect to the judiciary to say I think the court was wrong to pronounce on what is essentially a political question at a time.
Order! Whatever the strength and intensity of feeling and the passions to which these matters give rise, we must hear.
I think they should listen to this, Mr. Speaker. They have until the House rises today to table a motion of no confidence in the government. Come on then. And we can have that vote tomorrow. Or if any of the other parties, the smaller parties, fancy a go, they can table that motion and we'll give you the time for a vote.
In the words of the Supreme Court, this, Mr. Speaker, was 10 minutes of bluster from a dangerous Prime Minister who thinks he is above the law. But in truth, Mr. Speaker, is not fit for the office which he holds.
Some whips have been checking up this week on whether some leadership campaign teams defeated in July by Boris Johnson might be stirring on manoeuvres, sensing the Prime Minister's reign might be short.
If you look at it like this, we've just gone through a leadership election, literally within the past 2 months. So it's still raw, it's still open.
Febrile.
It's febrile, the cabinets are coming together.
Everybody's wondering whether someone's going to make a move.
Exactly. And
you know, what do you think?
My gut feeling is I think there's always one, isn't there? Let's be truthful about this.
Someone might.
There's always one.
This is one of the most exciting times possible in Parliament.
Jeremy Corbyn's supporters insist that the Labour leader stands ready to move into number 10 if Boris Johnson's government is removed. But some MPs say it can't be him heading any caretaker government and talk of other names as temporary premier.
Margaret Beckett or Ken Clarke or Hilary Benn.
All those are possible
running
people.
a government for a few months.
For a few months.
To get a referendum.
To get a referendum.
100 ministers appointed from different parties.
We're quite willing to do it.
Policies across the range of activities. You can't just freeze everything.
You can't freeze everything, but you have to act in the caretaker capacity for most things and look after, make sure that nothing goes horribly wrong.
So a kind of zombie caretaker government that's just stewarding us towards a referendum.
Well, if it gets us a referendum, I think that by its very nature says it's not a zombie government.
Parliament's first day summoned back was dominated by demands from the government to close it down again for a general election, which the opposition won't grant them until Brexit is delayed.
Well, with me now is the former Justice Secretary David Gauke and the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey. Ed Davey first. Boris Johnson's thrown down the gauntlet. Vote of no confidence. Why don't you do it?
We want to get Boris Johnson out as soon as possible. He's a lawbreaker and he's running a very incompetent government. But we also need to put the national interest first, and that means stopping no deal, getting no deal off the table. And Joe Swinson for the Liberal Democrats has put forward the idea to other party leaders, because we want to work cross-party. I'm proud we're working cross-party. And the idea is that we bring the requirement for the Prime Minister to ask for an extension of Article 50 earlier, so we can get no deal off the table earlier.
How soon?
Well, that would be up to other parties to agree with us. We'd like to bring it forward a week or even 2 weeks, and that would give us more time. And then, when we got it off the table, then we can start talking about a referendum or a general election.
So within days, how do you feel about that, David Gauke, forcing Boris Johnson to go back to Brussels sooner to request an extension?
Well, the reason why the trigger date was the 19th of October was because that was after the European Council meeting on the 17th and 18th of October, which is the last opportunity to make progress towards getting a deal. So it still seems to me reasonable to wait until that process has been completed. If the Prime Minister hasn't got a deal at that point, then it is right that we trigger the Ben provisions and seek an extension. That should leave enough time to deal with any attempts to get out of the legal requirements, for the courts to look at this if necessary. So I think that's enough time to do it on the 19th of October.
But isn't the Prime Minister right when he says the only way out of this is a general election?
No, I don't think it is. I think the way out of it is that we try to get a deal, that the majority in the House of Commons can support whatever that might require. And I think there is an onus on the Prime Minister and the government to redouble their efforts in terms of getting a deal, in terms of being realistic as to our red lines with the European Union, not asking for things that can't be delivered, and then working across the floor of the House to try to find a majority in favour of a route forward.
You're determined to block any deal, you've made that clear. So you're thwarting the will of 17.4 million people.
Well, there was 16.8 million who voted the other way, and Liberal Democrats have always been consistent, been clearer than any other party, that we want to stop Brexit. So I'm certainly not denying that, but we want to do that in a democratic way. So we think the best way of doing that is a people's vote, and we will continue to argue for that. But if the other parties refuse that vote for the people, so they could democratically choose to remain in the European Union, then we'll have to have the general election. And in that general election, we will campaign to stop Brexit. We've done that all the way along. Unfortunately, from the Labour Party, you have complete confusion, and from the Conservative Party, from this appalling Prime Minister, you have chaos.
Are you tempted by a second referendum? Because you've always resisted it.
I have. I would much prefer to leave with a deal without having a second referendum. That remains my preference. And the point I would make to a lot of my Conservative, perhaps I should say former Conservative colleagues, is that if they don't back a deal, then there clearly is a move towards a second referendum. That is the direction that we're going in. I don't say that with any great enthusiasm, but that's why I hope all Conservative MPs can get behind a deal. But the onus is also on the Prime Minister to get that deal.
When the Prime Minister talks about abiding by the law, but also leaving on October the 31st, does that mean some kind of shenanigans, which means we're going to end up in front of the courts again?
Well, I can't see how you can abide by the law and leave on the 31st of October unless you have got a deal. And I don't understand how the Prime Minister thinks he can do both unless he thinks he's going to get a deal.
The problem is no one trusts this Prime Minister. He's lost all credibility. He's been found out in the courts. We know he's a perpetual person who breaks his word. And some people are now talking in this House that he's lied to Her Majesty the Queen. So because he's lost that trust, that's why Liberal Democrats are arguing for getting no deal off the table as soon as possible, because we just don't trust him. Imagine if we get to the 19th of October. Imagine if he then doesn't seek the extension as the law requires and we're in the courts. There's a danger that we could slip out of the European Union, and that's why we as the Liberal Democrats are leading the charge for an earlier no deal off the table, an earlier extension to Article 50.
And is that something you'd back?
I think there is time from the 19th of October to the 31st of October to go through the courts, to do everything that we need to do to ensure that the Benn Act is triggered, enacted and the extension achieved.
Is he dangerous, the Prime Minister?
I don't know whether I'd describe him as that, but I think
How
it
would
is.
You describe
well, I think it is important that the Prime Minister, I think, does need to change his strategy. He does need to try to unite the country to a greater extent. I think he does need to reach out, and I think he does need to be pragmatic and practical in terms of delivering a deal and not making demands that simply are not going to be achieved.
David Gauke, Ed Davey, thank you very much for joining us. Well, in the last half hour, Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, asked Mr Johnson about his conduct in public office with reference to his alleged links with the US tech entrepreneur Jennifer Arcuri.
The Prime Minister also has questions to answer about his conduct in public office. And in particular, allegations that he failed to declare an interest in the allocation of public money to a close friend whilst he was Mayor of London. It was announced today that the Department of Culture, Media and Sport is reviewing the funds allocated in the light of the Sunday Times report. Did the Prime Minister initiate that review? Will the Prime Minister fully cooperate with the DCMS review and that of the Greater London Assembly? Will he refer himself to the Cabinet Secretary for investigation? Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister, no Prime Minister, is not above the law.
Well, and I am very proud, by the way, to take his next point, about everything that I did as Mayor of London. I may say to the current Mayor that he'd be better off spending less on press officers and more on police officers in London, because we're funding 20,000 more on our streets.
Well, Mr Johnson has insisted that everything was done entirely in the proper way, while the Culture Department says it's investigating a grant worth £100,000 to one of Ms Arcuri's companies. So what do we know so far? Our political correspondent Paul McNamara has more.
Hi everyone, my name is Jennifer Arcuri and I am the co-founder and CEO of Hacker House.
Hacker House, a firm of ethical hackers that received a government grant of £100,000. But what MPs want to know is whether there's a conflict of interest between the nature of the relationship between the firm's CEO and Boris Johnson and the allocation of public funds. As soon as Parliament reopened today, they queued up to ask the government department with their hands on the purse strings.
I care very little about the personal life of the Prime Minister, but I care a lot about how this government manages conflicts of interest and how it spends taxpayers' money.
This is fundamentally a question of character and of suitability. Is the Prime Minister of sufficient character to occupy high office and disperse public funds?
Will the Minister reassure the House that there will be no other examples of friends with benefits funding from DCMS or any other department?
Awkward questions, and today the Digital Minister confirmed the grant was being reviewed.
We are, of course, aware of the claims raised recently by the Sunday Times, and the department is reviewing the decision that was taken, but we monitor all initiatives that have been...
And there were further questions as to whether the firm should have even been eligible for UK government money, as most of the staff and business appear to be based in America.
This is a company that is based in Britain as far as Companies House is concerned. It is a company with a British phone number. We will review that, but we have no reason to think we have no reason to think that there is anything untoward in this particular matter.
That issue of the UK number was seized upon by Tom Watson. He said that when members of his team tried to call it, it went through to America.
Thank you for calling Hacker House. Please note this call
Sounds like an American voice. In fact, when we called them earlier on, after that pre-recorded message, we got through to someone from the firm, and they confirmed they're in California. They told us they had offices in the US and the UK, but didn't provide further details. Questions of conflict of interest first arose when the Sunday Times revealed another tech firm Ms Arcuri ran received grants from a London mayoral organisation while Boris Johnson was mayor, and had joined trade missions abroad.
Well, we know that she was on 3 trips, but there was a trip to the Far East in November 2014, when the mayor was specifically asked a question to name all the Delhi members of the delegate, and he gave names of all the members of the delegation apart from one name. The name he missed out was of Jennifer Crury. And it's interesting why he missed the name out. Was it just sort of forgetfulness? Was there anything else behind it? We want to give him the opportunity of answering those sort of questions.
The Greater London Assembly Oversight Committee have asked Mr Johnson to provide details of any relationship. Both the Prime Minister and Ms Arcuri insist there is no impropriety.
Paul McNamara reporting there. Well, the Prime Minister is still on his feet in the Commons. Let's just have a listen to what he's saying in response.
And I'd like to hear from them that they will, Mr Speaker. We will, I'm very confident, make progress towards getting a deal, and I hope it will command their support.
Yvette Cooper.
Earlier today, the Attorney-General did not just say that he would respect the Supreme Court's judgment, he also said, we got it wrong. The Prime Minister has today just said the opposite and effectively said he thinks it's okay for a Prime Minister to cancel Parliament for as long as he so chooses in order to not to answer questions. Many of us have had disagreements with his predecessors, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, David Cameron, John Major, Margaret Thatcher, but none of them would have done this. None of them them would have been so chaotic, none of them would have shown such disregard for the rule of law or tried to concentrate power in their own hands by cancelling Parliament in this way. Why is he so entitled that he thinks it's one rule for one person and one rule for him and a different one from everyone else?
Mr. Speaker, I think the historical record will reflect that several Prime Ministers, and I think all Prime Ministers have had prorogations, and John Major, for instance, prorogued for several weeks, I think, in advance of an election. But on her substantive question about the view of my right honourable learned colleague, the Attorney General, about the judgment yesterday. Let's be clear that we are as one in respecting the Supreme Court, and we are as one in thinking that judgment was wrong.
Well, Boris Johnson responding there to some pretty forthright criticism from the Labour MP Yvette Cooper. He does appear at the moment to be rather enjoying the exchange, but how long that will last, we'll have to wait and see. He'll be on his feet for a while longer. Now over to Jackie on the Green in Westminster.
Thanks, Cathy. Well, with the prospect of a no-deal Brexit still very much on the table, the Minister in charge of planning for one, Michael Gove, has been insisting that many businesses are well prepared. Labour's Keir Starmer rejected that idea, saying that to leave the country unprepared was unforgivable. Well, we've seen documents given to one Manchester hospital and no doubt replicated across England, revealing the concerns many in the NHS have about the future. Our health and social care correspondent Victoria MacDonald is with me now. What can you tell us, Victoria?
Well, Jackie, in fact, Michael Gove went on to say that most of the work to mitigate the risk of a no-deal Brexit had actually gone into the NHS. And I know that civil servants have been working very hard in the Department of Health and Social Care to try and alleviate this risk. Nevertheless, as you said, there are concerns. These documents have been given to will be presented to the board at Christie's Hospital tomorrow, and they lay out the concerns that are being felt across the country. Isotopes, for instance, needed for scans. Now, the government has said that they can be flown in, so there's no risk of them being held up at ports because they have a very short shelf life. But what we don't know is what happens if those flights can't make it. We don't know if there are enough drivers. There are concerns about drugs. What happens when the stockpiles get low and they have to start replenishing them? This document also went on to say, which was quite sad in a way, about anecdotal evidence, so there's no proof of this, that trials, UK researchers are starting to be left off trials that are across Europe because they can't come to the table, as it were. And then there is now an announcement that NHS England will require trusts from the 21st of October, so just 10 days before that critical date, to start giving daily reports on where they are with the planning. I can give you some good news. The flu vaccines have arrived in the country, so if you need a flu jab, you should be safe.
Victoria MacDonald with a little bit of good news. Thank you very much for joining us.
He may have been forced back to Parliament by the courts, but this evening Boris Johnson did not look like a Prime Minister chastised by the judges. He was unrepentant, unapologetic and combative, almost daring the opposition to try to bring him down by agreeing to a general election. Mr Johnson wasn't the only one using blunt language. Opposition MPs who had fought for Parliament to get back to work returned to exchanging insults over Brexit. But when one Labour MP called on the Prime Minister to tone down his language, invoking the memory of Jo Cox, her murdered parliamentary colleague, Mr Johnson described her remarks as humbug. There was uproar and disdain on the Labour benches.
He arrived back from New York, courtesy of the RAF this morning. But even the smoothest flight can't stop this Prime Minister from landing with a bump. The cameras tracking his car, but it's the judges who set the sat-nav. The courts calling him back to Westminster, where he emerged with a head of hair as dishevelled as his premiership. Over at Parliament, MPs were arriving back too.
Parliament will sit today and we'll scrutinise what the government's going to do.
Let's respect the highest court in the land. Let's get back to work.
Though it's not clear exactly what they'll do. What solution is out there that hasn't already been tried and discussed and debated?
Well, I mean, I realise that, you know, and people moan and say that they want it to end. Believe you me, when you're sitting in the front line of it, I too want it to end.
Hands off
Inside, Parliament's return risked, looking purely ceremonial.
Welcome back to our place of work.
But MPs got straight down to it. If the Attorney-General was the warm-up act, well, he certainly got things heated as he turned on Parliament itself.
This Parliament is a dead Parliament. It should no longer sit. They could vote no confidence at any time. But they're too cowardly. The time is coming, Mr. Speaker, when even these turkeys won't be able to prevent Christmas.
Tempers already frayed, now totally in tatters.
For a man like him, a party like this, and a leader like this Prime Minister, to talk about morals and morality is a disgrace!
The scene nicely set for the Prime Minister to step forward, having tried to silence MPs. Tonight, he was about to hear them all the louder.
Statement, the Prime Minister.
This would be an almighty punch-up with Parliament, his first blow refusing to apologise for suspending it.
It is absolutely no disrespect to the judiciary to say I think the court was wrong to pronounce on what is essentially a political question.
Offering no guarantees, he won't just prorogue Parliament again. Tonight, he egged on the opposition to bring him down.
They have until the House rises today to table a motion of no confidence in the government.
But MPs won't vote for his departure until they're sure he'll delay Britain's from the EU.
It's very simple. If you want an election, if he wants an election, get an extension and let's have an election.
As the Prime Minister accused MPs of surrendering to the EU, they fumed with anger, evoking the memory of their murdered colleague, Jo Cox.
We stand here, Mr. Speaker, under the shield of our departed friend, with many of us in this place subject to death threats and abuse every single day. And let me tell the Prime Minister that they often quote his words: surrender act, betrayal, traitor, and I, for one, am sick of it.
I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I've never heard such humbug in all my life. Because the best way to honour the memory of Jo Cox would be, I think, to get Brexit done.
Tonight, many left disgusted at his response.
This whole approach of pitting Parliament against the people is dishonest and dangerous. Dishonest because there are legitimate differences of opinion amongst different MPs, different factions, and we need to find the common ground. And dangerous because it starts to ramp up people's behaviour.
But if the Prime Minister can't win his own battle here, then he's willing to start one between Parliament and the people. Paul Brand, News at 10, Westminster.
Well, before the Prime Minister stood up to speak in the Commons, he spoke to our political editor in the calmer atmosphere of his office. But he was equally unrepentant and just as combative. He was also confrontational on the motives of the Supreme Court judges, alleging that theirs was a political ruling. But beyond the rhetoric, Robert R. started by asking him how he was going to secure Brexit by October the 31st, while still obeying the laws set by Parliament.
The Attorney-General said today that you would abide by the so-called Benn Act, which says if you can't get a deal, you've got a right to the EU requesting an extension. So you're going to write this letter, are you?
Well, we're going to go for a deal.
But you're conceding there's a reasonable prospect you're not going to get a deal.
And under those circumstances, what I can say to you is that we will respect the law and we will come out on October the 31st.
But those two statements, many would say, are completely incompatible.
Well, we will respect the law and we will come out on October the 31st. Well, obviously, we've got some tough negotiations ahead.
We had this dramatic ruling yesterday from the Supreme Court, which you have described as a court interfering in political questions.
Clearly, I respect it. I think it's wrong. The court has erred in the sense that it has pronounced on the political question of what Parliament should be debating at a certain
No, it hasn't. It simply said sovereignty lies with MPs, which surely you would agree with that.
Actually, if you look at what the President of the Court said, she was very clear that the issue that she thought Parliament should be debating was Brexit.
No, she explicitly said that's not what was on her mind. She said her decision had nothing to do with Brexit.
Well,
she was explicit about that, Prime Minister.
I don't wish to impugn her motives at all, but what she said in her findings was that it was appropriate for Parliament at this stage to be debating Brexit. For the moment, what we need to do is take account of the ruling, put it into practice. Here we are. Parliament is back.
Will you prorogue it before the Queen's speech?
I would like to have a Queen's speech. We will have to absorb the full implications of the ruling.
You're not going to resign.
No.
What would it take to get you to resign? What would you have to do wrong?
Well, we've got to get on and deliver Brexit on October the 31st. That's the most. That's the biggest function of this government. That's what I want to do.
And Robert joins me now from his studio ahead of his show tonight. Robert, if anyone, I suppose, thought that Boris Johnson would be contrite or apologetic after the court decision yesterday, that just wasn't how it panned out in his talk to you, was it? Or in Parliament?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's almost impossible to think of anything more humiliating for a Prime Minister than being told by the highest court in the land that he had misled the Queen in saying it was lawful to suspend Parliament sitting, send MPs home. That's what happened to Boris Johnson yesterday. Today, I spent a long time with him in an interview, which, you know, all of it can be seen in my show After the News. And, you know, he didn't show the slightest sign of contrition or regret or that he'd been knocked off course. He made this extraordinary statement that he would both abide by the law that says he's got to write a letter asking for a Brexit delay, and then said there won't be a Brexit delay. We're leaving on October the 31st. Now, you know, Amber Rudd, who's also on my show, said she simply thought those were completely irreconcilable, incompatible statements. She hasn't got a clue how he's going to get us out on the 31st of October. And all of this was taking place before he then inflamed passions in Parliament by using what many people regarded as utterly inflammatory language to describe his opponents, you know, saying that they were surrendering and using the word humbug, and then making the extraordinary statement that, you know, Jo Cox's best way to honour her memory was to deliver Brexit, which nobody understood. So an amazing performance by the Prime Minister. Amber Rudd thinks it's all quite dangerous. I think many people watching tonight will agree.
OK, Robert, thank you very much. And Robert's programme, as he said, will be available here shortly after the news. So do stay tuned for that.
You can choose which side of the Atlantic you prefer to watch your constitutional chaos. In the US, impeachment proceedings have begun against Donald Trump. The press conference he gave an hour ago was bewildering. We'll be speaking to his former director of communications later. Both Trump and Johnson are leaders trying to frame themselves as the hero of the people, good, against the establishment, bad. We'll report on each and ask what the curious mirror imaging tells us about the language of global politics right now. Nick Watt joins us. Take us through those scenes this evening, Nick.
Well, as you saw just there, Emily, emotionally charged scenes in Parliament after those remarks by the Prime Minister saying humbug after a Labour MP cited the murder of Jo Cox, the late Labour MP, and asked the Prime Minister to tone down his language. I spoke to a very, very good friend of Jo Cox, a Labour MP. This Labour MP was absolutely devastated. Lucy Powell, a former Labour member of the Shadow Cabinet, also knew Jo Cox very well. She made a point of order, and Lucy Powell said that there was a context in which Jo Cox was murdered, and that context is similar today. In the last hour, Brendan Cox, Jo Cox's widower, has tweeted, and he said, "I feel a bit sick at Jo's name being used in this way." Now, Boris Johnson said when he launched his campaign for the leadership that when he seeks to deliver his goals on Brexit, the plasterwork will fall in. Well, he certainly lived up to that reputation today.
Prime Minister!
A nation divided a Parliament in turmoil. Instructed by the judiciary to resume his place, the Prime Minister went on the offensive.
This Parliament must either stand aside and let this government get Brexit done, or bring a vote of confidence and finally face the day of reckoning with the voters.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of his statement. Unfortunately, it was like his illegal shutting down of Parliament. Null, of no effect, and should be quashed.
In some of the rowdiest scenes in years, Boris Johnson sparked uproar when a Labour MP asked him to tone down his language.
With many of us in this place subject to death threats and abuse every single day. And let me tell the Prime Minister that they often quote his words: surrender act, betrayal, traitor. And I, for one, am sick of it. We must moderate our language, and it has to come from the Prime Minister first. Absolutely. So I would be interested in hearing his opinion. He should be absolutely ashamed of himself.
I think, Mr. Speaker, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I've never heard such humbug in all my life.
And this after a similar call from the MP who succeeded the murdered MP, Joe Cox.
What I will say is that the best way to honour the memory of Joe Cox, and indeed the best way to bring this country together, would be, I think, to get Brexit done.
Labour was horrified by the Prime Minister's performance today.
Well, it was Donald Trump-style demagoguery from Boris Johnson today. The Conservative Party has changed, and certainly not for the better. Well, I think it's quite extraordinary scenes, but what this is part and parcel of is a wealthy, privileged, hard-right establishment personified by people like Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Geoffrey Cox, posing as being anti-establishment. The truth is, despite their boorish behaviour, nothing could be further from the truth. They aren't anti-establishment, they are the establishment.
The Liberal Democrats were equally appalled.
This is very dangerous politics. This is the politics of a demagogue, almost of a dictator, wanting to turn the people, turn the mob against the institutions of democracy which keep our country safe. And I'm sorry, but the Prime Minister and the Attorney General behaviour today brings them into disrepute. It shows how appalling they have become and how extreme they've become. And I think people out there, seeing these scenes in our Parliament, seeing what the Prime Minister and the Attorney General said, I hope they will reject that call to the mob and they will say no.
A Brexiteer Tory defended the Prime Minister's tactics today.
The people voted to leave, and Parliament won't let us. We have this fifth column in Parliament, which from the very start has sought to use every possible strategy in order to prevent us leaving, including going behind the government's back and its negotiating position and persuading the EU not to negotiate because they don't need to. Parliament will deliver them, Britain remaining in the EU.
Boris Johnson is keen to disabuse MPs of the notion that he is in any way cowed after the Supreme Court ruled that he acted unlawfully in suspending Parliament. Today marked an all-out assault on his opponents across the House as he doubles down on his do-or-die pledge to leave the EU by the 31st of October, deal or no deal. All calm outside. Inside, a boisterous day as this Prime Minister makes clear he is playing by different rules.
That was Nick Watt, and we're joined now by the Conservative MP, leading Brexiteer Bernard Jenkin, the Lib Dem Layla Moran, Labour Shadow Secretary of State for International Development, Barry Gardiner, and the former Conservative MP, Remain Rebel, Antoinette Sambach. We don't want to rehash Brexit positions. I think the audience probably feels they've heard enough, but we do want to know what you make of today. Nick called it boisterous. It was horrendous, wasn't it, watching those scenes in Parliament tonight, Bernard?
Well, I was in for part of those proceedings. I didn't actually see Paula Sheriff's intervention, though I've seen it on film, obviously. Feelings are running very high. The dispute is very doctrinaire on both sides, and people are becoming very heated and perhaps saying things in a manner which makes me rather sad, I have to tell you.
Geoffrey Cox, let's start at the beginning. He said Parliament was dead and doesn't have the moral right to sit. He was pitting Parliament against the people.
Well, I mean, the answer is there are competing legitimacies here. There is the traditional legitimacy of our representative democracy, but Parliament itself chose to have the referendum and put the rather bland question, leave or remain, to the British people, and the British people voted leave. So you've got the Prime Minister and the government appealing to one legitimacy, the direct legitimacy, and Parliament, the Remainers in Parliament, resting their legitimacy on the representative.
This isn't about argument. This is about the language that you use in the House of Commons. Parliament is dead and doesn't have the moral right to sit. You know that was meant to be a soundbite that appealed to people who want to blame parliamentarians for what's happening.
Well, because of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act and because we have a minority administration, we are in a curious position where the government cannot actually command a majority in the House. I mean, I think everyone would agree, the government doesn't really have the confidence of the House. But the House won't actually strike the government down because it doesn't want to have a general election.
Just should be working.
Well, actually, I haven't come here to have an argument. I've been asked a question.
Now, Antoinette, I'll bring you in. I promise that I do
You'll
these
get a free
separately.
run in a minute.
Let me just put to you, Stephen Crabb said he was embarrassed. He was horrified by the language. He was shocked by the language that Boris Johnson used tonight. Let me remind you what he said. He said the best way to honour Joe Cox's memory is to get Brexit done. Female MP after female MP said that the language that was used about surrendering and about betrayal was making their lives unsafe. And that's what he responds. You must be ashamed of him.
Well, I think, as I say, everybody is. I mean, think of the strain the Prime Minister's under, as much as anybody else in the House of Commons in these circumstances. And
you're feeling sorry for him tonight.
I'm feeling sorry for everybody in politics at the moment. I think the whole thing is a mess. I think the House of Commons is making... I think the House of Commons as an institution is losing the respect of the British people. I think we have...
Whose fault is this mess, though? I mean, you heard what he said tonight. He dismissed the concerns of Paula Sheriff, who said she's subject to death threats and abuse, by calling it humbug.
Well, it's not a word I would have used personally. But I think, as I say, everybody is under a very great deal of strain. The problem here is Parliament promised to implement the result of the referendum and Parliament has failed to do so, and that is creating a great deal of strain on our constitutional system.
Parliament has, as you know, tried very hard, and some of your former colleagues, like Antoinette Sambach, has voted for a deal that would have seen us leave three times where you haven't.
Well, I didn't want to vote for a deal that basically means, while we technically leave the European Union, nothing changes.
Well,
that's not what people voted for.
Everyone's got their reason for where we are tonight.
But what we hope is that Boris is going to bring back an agreement that the House can vote on and the House will approve, that will be different from the existing agreement.
I just wonder how you feel as a Brexiteer supporting a Prime Minister like Boris Johnson tonight. Jeremy Corbyn asked if Boris Johnson's conduct in public office could be defended. Allegations, as you know, at the weekend, he failed to declare an interest in public money whilst mayor. A grant worth £100,000 of taxpayers' money is now being reviewed. This was before the scenes tonight. And you have to stand there and say, I can defend the character of this man?
I defend the fact that the Prime Minister is duly appointed as the Prime Minister of the country and is trying to deliver Brexit, which the British people voted for, and Parliament is frustrating.
You're a lifelong Brexiteer. You're a lifelong Brexiteer who is committed...
Actually, I'm not a lifelong Brexiteer. I never wanted to leave the European Union until we were confronted with the in-out choice. I went to see David Cameron and I said, do not do an in-out referendum. Get yourself a mandate for the changes you want in a referendum. Do not polarise. You will smash the Conservative Party. You will divide the country. It will be disastrous. And if David Cameron had taken my advice, we wouldn't be in this mess now.
Well, OK, that was news I didn't know. But right now, you are supporting a Prime Minister with what you think is the one chance of delivering Brexit. And this man is a shambles.
Well, that's your opinion.
Well, I'm asking you.
Well, I don't think he is a shambles. I think the Parliament is a shambles.
You can stand here tonight and say everything that has happened in the last month has gone according to plan, and you are proud to be a Conservative MP in that party.
I don't think any of us would say we're proud of our political party and our political situation at this moment, because what Parliament is doing to itself and to the country at the moment is failing to honour the promise it made to the British people that the result of the referendum would be implemented. And that is causing a great deal of strain on our constitution. It's having massive collateral damage across our constitutional settlement, creating an enormous amount of uncertainty. And it would be far better if we just got Brexit done.
Layla Moran, you sat before a Tory MP saying, if you don't like me, call a vote of no confidence in me, get me out of here. Tempted?
Believe me, I mean, all this, I'm sorry to say, Bernard, what you just said has made me really very upset. I mean, I actually think that you're better than this, and I think most of parliamentarians are better than what we saw in the House today, and actually I would defend the vast majority of them. And I don't think that Boris Johnson speaks for us, and I don't think he speaks for the vast majority of people in this country. We have absolutely called for him to resign. I think that is the right thing for him to do. But look at what we're seeing today. This is why.
You were invited to pull the trigger tonight. You can call a vote of no confidence.
But let me explain why. Because this is, you know, we've seen, this is someone who has had to be hauled before the Supreme Court for not obeying the law. Until an extension is asked for and achieved, we cannot risk going off the cliff edge of no deal. And whether, you know, you can argue numbers, but the fact is, at the last general election, the one that I was elected in 2017, the people delivered a hung parliament that did not accept a no-deal Brexit.
You don't have to have an election. You can call a vote of no confidence.
We have to wait.
You can back the leader of the opposition. You can put Jeremy Corbyn in a place where he could deliver whatever you wanted, which is an end to no-deal Brexit. Why won't you sign up to that if the SNP has?
First of all, Jeremy Corbyn, I don't think, has the command of the whole of the House. Remember, he doesn't just have to carry his own party, he also has to carry backbench Conservative MPs or former Conservative MPs in order to do that. We have to take no deal off the table before we play.
Why do the SNP say that he should be allowed to do that? If you, as a Remain party, believe so strongly that the most important thing now is to stop no-deal Brexit, you'd all get behind one person.
I think the SNP are showing that actually they care more about their own electoral chances than they do about taking no deal off the table. If they were serious about that, then they would go with the plan. You take no deal off the table, and that's exactly what we're here to do. We've come back, and top of the list of what we need to do is take no deal off the table. At that point, everything is possible. And we, as Liberal Democrats, have said we are committed to working with everyone. In a very different way, I have to say, to this divisive language that's being used in the House. Actually, I think what this tonight will do is strengthen the resolve of those of us who do want to work together to get ourselves through the impasse and do Britain proud. And I don't think the Prime Minister is representing those people right now.
Let's see if Barry Gardiner can help us with that. You are the main opposition party and you won't call a vote of no confidence. If you were confident in your own leader, you would.
No, look, if we get an extension, we get an election. But I want to say something about the inflammatory language that was used. And I want to say this, it was calculated. It was calculated and it was orchestrated for one very clear purpose, and that was to refocus Parliament and the public's attention from all the questions that earlier in the day they refused to answer. 7, was it, or 8 times that Michael Gove refused to answer the key questions about the Yellowhammer Papers, about when was the date changed, what was the date that the title was changed, and who authorised its change. 7 or 8 times he was asked that, all across the House. He refused to give an answer. It was designed to take our attention away from the fact that no evidence was given by this government to the Supreme Court for the prorogation, for one very simple reason, that our bloody marvellous civil servants, not one of them would commit perjury and put that evidence in there, because that's what they were asked to do. And, you know, we have to realise that what is going on with this Trumpian populism, with the way in which this incendiary language is being cranked up, it's to deflect attention from all the things that are really important in our democracy and the sort of things that you mentioned about the Hacker House and so on. Because actually, that is not just the Prime Minister doing something that is unlawful. Potentially, That is malfeasance in public office. Potentially, it could even be a criminal offence. So, because he overrode his civil servants. So
Barry,
these are the
I can
important
hear
things.
your anger, and I want to return to the question, because you have it within your power. You're the main opposition party. It is unthinkable that any other opposition party at a point in this cycle would not be able to unseat a Prime Minister of this place right now. So why don't you go for it?
Two things. One, because we need to be sure that, you see, if we call a general election, if we went for a general election, the Prime Minister, under our Constitution,
you don't need a general election.
Has the power
it's the
to
same
change the
point
day.
I put to Layla. You can install a caretaker government. You tell me whether you're thinking of Margaret Beckett, who is the name mooted at the moment, who might appeal to more people than your own leader. Would you put her in
one
place?
Of the best leaders we never had in the Labour Party.
Right. Would you install her as a caretaker leader?
The point is this. The point is this. You've just heard that actually we don't have the numbers. You can't blame the Labour Party for not having the numbers in Parliament. That is in the gift of all the other opposition parties. Now, Jeremy has done an incredible job bringing the opposition parties together, and I pay tribute to everyone who round that table has come together, whether they've been from, former Conservatives, Change UK, people who on all sorts of other areas have huge political disagreement. But we have stuck together resolutely because we will not allow this government to throw this country off the cliff of a no deal.
Well, you suggested yesterday a second referendum should come before an election. I don't know if that is now Labour policy.
No, look, if you remember, that was in the context of if there were a coalition, if there were a caretaker and interim government, then I think what I said was, well, there would be a logic to that because we might be able to get...
So why are you saying if there were? It is within your grasp to create this if you wanted to. You just said all the opposition parties are working together.
No, you've just heard Layla say that there aren't the numbers to come together.
Well, she said she couldn't work with Jeremy Corbyn, actually. That's what she said.
That's not what I literally didn't just say that. I didn't say that.
So you could?
Yeah, I think we could work with anyone to make sure that we don't go off the cliff edge of no deal.
That's not what Jo Swinson said.
The problem
That's not what Jo Swinson
Jo has also... Jo has been quite clear too. We need to be sure that Jeremy Corbyn has the numbers, because as soon as you trigger the Fixed Term Parliament Act, you've then got a 14-day countdown style.
So the Lib Dems would work with Jeremy Corbyn as the caretaker Prime Minister.
Sorry, it's
I
not
just
about
don't
triggering...
see him having that numbers, particularly on the Conservative backbenches. That's my point.
Layla, with respect, it's not about triggering the Fixed Term Parliament Act, because if you do that, you then go into a general election scenario and you give the control to the Prime Minister.
Not if you reach the 50%, but not the two-thirds.
OK, I'm going to bring in Antoinette, because we haven't heard from you. Are you in a position where you would vote against your own party, your former party now, if we were in a position of a vote of no confidence?
I'm very clear that I would not support Jeremy Corbyn going into number 10. And I think what has happened is that there has been a huge failure of leadership from both front benches. And from the start, after the referendum, given the closeness of the result, there should have been an effort to work across party and put into practice what Jo Cox's motto was, that we have more in common than what divides us. And I'm afraid the ERG and the right wing of the Conservative Party, the Spartans, who set up this language of betrayal and traitors, have a lot to answer for in undermining what I believe is consensus potential, the opportunity for consensus within Parliament.
Where does that take us tomorrow, then? What happens tomorrow?
So, I mean, it is the question that I asked the Prime Minister today when he came to the House. What steps is he taking to build consensus? Because what I've seen in his short term as Prime Minister is confrontation and conflict and not consensus building. And Parliament is reflecting the country. We need to go back as members of Parliament to our constituencies and sell a compromise to those that voted leave and those that voted remain. And that is the leadership that has been lacking, I would argue, in Parliament. And I'm afraid the right wing of the Conservative Party has a lot to answer for in the denigration of the debate.
Richard Drack said he didn't want to see Theresa May's deal in any shape or form reappear. Are you willing to take a compromise deal now?
I'm waiting to see what Boris is able to bring back before I make any decision on that.
You think we're going to...
My mind is open.
You think we'll leave on the 31st
I voted for the Brady compromise. And,
well, that wasn't a deal.
Well,
I mean,
it wasn't a deal, but it was an indication of where there is it was an indication of where there is a consensus in the House of Commons for an agreement that deals with the.
So if it resembled Theresa May's deal, would you be tempted to vote for it? Because you see where we are now, and you see how unlikely any form of compromise is getting.
I'm going to wait and see. I'm not going to prejudge what the Prime Minister may or may not bring back.
But there was an opportunity. I mean, we saw that there had been cross-party negotiations with Prime Minister May, and it was at that point when there looked like there was the opportunity for some consensus and agreement, and a new bill was going to come forward before the House. That's when the ERG struck to take her out of office. And I feel that to then have a Prime Minister that is pitting Parliament against the people, where my constituents were pretty well divided 50-50 in terms of the referendum, it's entirely wrong.
We've all seen the scenes tonight. How do you get to a place where compromise now seems possible? Because most of the public won't believe that's about to happen.
The Prime Minister was asked this evening by a number of people if he would reach out and try and engage and negotiate across the aisle. If he were to do that, and Antoinette has absolutely rightly said that you know, we did have those negotiations. Ultimately, they foundered, and there's no point in apportioning blame now, but they foundered. But those negotiations around a customs union, around, you know, rights and protections and environmental protections, all of that was on the table. Why can this Prime Minister not do what Theresa May ultimately failed to do and amend his red lines to do that, to reach out and try and create the compromise that could bring our country back together?
Well, what we have is a complete deadlock in Parliament and a government that can't command a majority for its main policy. Under normal circumstances, you would have a general election, but the opposition doesn't want one.
We're back where we started. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.